With the rate of technological change ever increasing and the adoption and uncertainty brought about by the recent developments in artificial intelligence, workers and students preparing to become workers are, trying to figure out what they need to study, what skills they need to learn, how to think about ongoing learning and skills development. So we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into that and see, what I see as working well and helpful, and what are some areas where there might be gaps and where people might want to consider augmenting learning and training that's provided for them with setting their own direction a little bit. So, welcome to the Talk to Me PDD Hot Podcast. I'm your host, PDD. We talk about all things knowledge work, tech, society, management, and leadership. Today is episode 45, Career Skills for a Wicked World. So, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Follow me on all the platforms. Appreciate the support. So, you might be wondering about the title, the Wicked World. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that the world is bad, or at least because of this title. But it's from the book Range, which I've talked a little bit about before, by David Epstein, and it's really a reference to the type of learning environment or the type of environment that you're in. And there are two types. There is the kind environment, and then there is the wicked environment. And the real world is often of the wicked sort, so and for the world of work as well. So what are the differences between the two? What do we mean when we say wicked or kind in this context? So a kind environment, or an activity or a skill that you learn in a kind environment, is one where simply by doing it, by practicing that skill, by developing that specific skill, you get better, you're able to do more, you're able to have a predictable outcome. So these are games with sort of very defined rules and scenarios in terms of an actual game. You might think of chess, where it's very constrained, and simply by playing a lot of chess and understanding the rules of chess, you're going to get better at that. You don't have to necessarily bring in any outside knowledge or anything else. It's always going to have the same rules. The feedback you get is going to be consistent and in real time. Could also see this in work with some particular software developer tests or scores, and you practice for those tests, you get better at them, you get a better score, you get a predictable feedback. Where you're not doing well, you're going to have lower scores. Where you are doing well, you're going to have a better score. So it's very straightforward. Now, a wicked environment is much more of what we see in the real world. Even if part of the work that we do is in these kind environments, you don't necessarily have a set of rules that up front. They may be unclear, they may change or be incomplete. There may or may not be patterns that you can pick up, like you could in the game of chess, for example. And the feedback you get may be delayed, and it may even be inaccurate or potentially both. So you think about the world that we operate in, the world of work, where it may, let's say you're trying to get a promotion in some place. It may not necessarily be directly tied to performance. That's certainly an aspect of it, but maybe there are other factors, budget or politics or things that play into it, and those may change over time. So that's much more of like a wicked environment than you might expect or might think about. So with those all being said, a lot of the focus on learning for people who are already in the working world is around this concept of skilling, which I've talked a little bit about before. And skilling is not necessarily a bad thing. It's important, but I don't think it's going to be sufficient for most workers to get kind of the most development and the most durable development from their time invested in learning. So one of the definitions I found for skilling was to train a worker to do a particular task. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about it that we'll come back to is that you have this concept of it being learning specifically for a worker, not learning sort of in the general context of learning. And we'll refer back to that because there are some areas where I've seen skilling adopted that maybe doesn't make sense because it's not directly in a work environment. So skilling is often something that is very discrete and very measurable. So let's say you go through this particular training or do some particular test or assessment, and it's kind of, a binary 1 or 0, you've done it or you haven't done it. Or maybe in some situations you'll have some sort of competency-based model where, novice, intermediate, advanced, things like that. In practice, I think it's difficult to really implement that well for a variety of reasons, whether it's, you know, differences in how different groups self-report skills or just trying to translate certain skills into that environment. Um, but in a lot of ways, it's this desire to create the kind world where you can um, measure these things specifically, and then also sort of check off whether they're done or they're not. Whereas in reality, even with skills in a very defined space, there's often a continuum or continuous learning that happens. And I think some of this is from just the overall environment of datafication that we're in, where there is just so much data everywhere, and looking at learning and abilities and things like that, and trying to squeeze those into that box of data. Because if you can do that, then that allows you to solve those problems, which are often hard and messy human problems, with the same techniques you would for any other data problem. And sometimes this is well intentioned. You look at using skilling or kind of measures like that in the hiring process, and a lot of that is proposed as a way to help get around bias against hiring for people coming from higher education or for particular universities. In theory, it's a fairer approach or a more accessible approach if you sort of look at these specific skills and hire for those. So I think it's well intentioned, but the reality, I think, with a lot of hiring is it is messy in practice, and I don't know if that datafied approach of it is going to help, even when it is well intentioned. So a lot of it is focused on work, like we talked about, training workers to do a specific task. And that could be good, right? You have a job, there are specific tasks you need to do. Sometimes you need specific skills to do them. A skilling type approach can be great for those. And I would say that's part of the overall solution of sort of how you'll work as a worker. Even if the majority of your work is kind of employing one specific skill, there's always going to be other aspects that you have: communication, collaboration with others, that sort of thing. It's never going to be 100% just applying that skill. So skilling will be a part of most workers' lives and sort of their toolkit of abilities, and then it'll vary about how much it is, kind of depending on what your role is. But it's never going to be 100% of that. One of the areas that I do have a little bit of concern about skilling being applied is when I see it in more traditional learning settings like higher education or potentially high school or things like that. And it's not that it can't play a role there, but if you go back to the definition where skilling is really focused around work and what workers are going to do for a task, I've not always seen a great connection between what the world of education thinks those skills are and what will actually be applicable in the world of work. And especially if things are changing relatively quickly, even if you take someone at the start of a 4-year college degree and you try and go through some AI skilling that's relevant now or that we think is relevant now, the chances that that's going to be as relevant when they're graduating at the end of that 4-year program is probably not particularly high. So I think for one aspect that just tactically it's not often that well aligned to what's actually needed in industry. So I know colleges are under more and more pressure to put out graduates that can go directly and find jobs, but they're not always the best at doing that. And two, I really think the value in higher education is to build more general and durable learning and skills, and even beyond developing people as workers, developing them as human beings that are well-rounded and thoughtful and can kind of draw on a bunch of disciplines and apply those in a variety of ways. And that's something that people will be able to do regardless of the specific technical skills that change over time. And that's one of the really interesting takeaways in Range as well, looking at a lot of the innovators or people who have found various breakthroughs. They were not necessarily people who were just 100% focused on the skills in their one domain, but they had a lot of breadth and they were able to draw inferences and analogies across different domains and think in different ways to create breakthroughs that maybe some of their more quote unquote skilled specialist colleagues weren't able to do. So I think having that breadth, both for sort of personal growth and sort of being able to experience humanity fully, but then also applying that for career success has a lot of application as well. Um, when people thought about the skills that would go away with the advent of more and more AI and work, and the skills that would become more and more important, the ones that I've seen listed as being more and more important are things like critical thinking, empathy, and leadership. Now, you can have skilling style learning for these, but these are not discrete and measurable skills, really. I mean, you can try and put things around that. And a lot of these things benefit from a breadth of experience. I think it's easier to be empathetic when you've had the experience or read about the experience of people in different situations and can understand what it's like to be in different circumstances, as opposed to having a very narrow view where maybe you only understand the circumstances of people who are deploying a specific skill in a specific role that you're in at the time. Likewise, critical thinking, that's something that you develop across many different domains. So I think especially in education, those breadth of skills, which is I think much more traditionally what education has been, actually are the best of both worlds in many ways. They're still continuing to develop people as learners and kind of well-rounded human beings, and also setting them up for longer term career success, even with all the change in technology, probably even more so because of that. Whereas time spent on specific skills may not be that relevant long run. And a lot of times the skills have a skilling type skills have a shorter lifespan than these more durable skills. You can look back at the history of various technologies that have been popular and that are no longer in use to see that. And that's just the nature that you're going to need to continue to learn and to evolve. And there's always going to be some skilling component to it. And that'll get you a shorter return. And it may be very important, kind of depending on what things are going on. And we all likely need to have that. But being able to maintain and continue those longer term durable skills are really important. So that was kind of a bit about education, and then the circling back kind of to us in the professional world, where it can be tempting just to fall into that skilling side of things, because those are often what are promoted and easily available to us. I think both from a practical way, they tend to be shorter and easily measurable, and that works nicely with various metrics and things like that, and they are helpful. But I don't think they're the full picture, and I think we're selling ourselves and our learning short if we're not also developing ourselves in other ways to build more durable skills outside of that. So how do you do that practically? I think it's not just constraining yourself directly in the skills for the position that you're in the moment, or even quote unquote future technical skills, but trying to look more broadly, trying to read whether that is things happening in the industry or books and different things, but not just what you would see directly relevant to the work that you're doing, but just broadly over the human experience, different domains, fiction, nonfiction, looking into various types of talks from people, if you're looking for things aside from reading, and just following sort of what's going on in different areas and practicing the empathy piece, understanding, thinking, putting yourself into different roles and situations and thinking about how you would feel there, trying to analyze and break down different ways of looking at a particular problem or situation, trying to make an argument for maybe a side that you don't agree with. And then just always trying, leadership is something that you can always practice regardless of what role or what situation that you're in. So looking to continuously do those things and continuously set your own learning goals and path and seek out those ways to develop those more durable skills that aren't, nicely measurable on a spreadsheet or as a checkbox, but ultimately are going to pay dividends and allow you to transfer those skills and knowledge across a variety of domains and a variety of technologies, because they're going to continue to change. And that's our best bet, to build a skill set that has long-term return on our investment in learning. So I hope that was helpful. Keep up your skilling, but also don't neglect these other skills that are going to help you build critical thinking, empathy, and leadership. Hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, and looking forward to talking to you soon. Thanks.